organizing your campaign to take the best advantage of the tech options that are open to you, that is a really big question.
I'm Eric Wilson, managing partner of Startup Caucus, the home of campaign tech innovation on the right. Welcome to the Business of Politics show. On this podcast, you're joining in on a conversation with entrepreneurs, operatives, and experts who make professional politics happen. Fire up your dial-up modems because today we're going old school. Our guest first started working in digital politics back in the 1990s. Colin Delany is the founder of epolitics.com, an award-winning website covering the field of digital politics and online advocacy. He's also a digital strategist and consultant for campaigns and nonprofits. Colin is out with the 2023 edition of his book, How to Use the Internet to Change the World and Win Elections. There's a link to that book in our show notes if you want to go check it out. In today's conversation, we talk about the latest trends in digital campaigning, what decision makers need to know, and a trend that we hope dies in 2024. Colin, you've been at this for a long time. I'm curious, what surprises you the most about the trajectory of digital politics during that time?
Oh, that's a great question. There are a lot of things that haven't surprised me, like the greater public involvement in the process of campaigning and really in the process of politics. I think perhaps the biggest trend or the biggest development that surprises me is still how little the majority of folks out there in the field know about what options are available to them. I constantly talk with people who maybe aren't embedded in the digital advertising world, but who are, very active in the, political campaigning or grassroots political organizing, who have no idea that programmatic advertising exists or is a thing. And I think that, I don't know, who has fallen down on the job? Is it us, the professionals? Is it the political parties? I don't know where it comes from. But if you don't know what your options are, how can you evaluate a strategy, right? That, you start talking about OTT versus programmatic versus social versus search for advertising, just for advertising, right? And, people's eyeballs start to roll back in their skulls. So to me, that's a real obstacle for us trying to do our jobs as effectively as we can, that the clients and the colleagues sometimes simply don't have the same background that we do to be able to evaluate and make the best decisions that they can.
Yeah, let's unpack that for a little bit, because I think there are a few things going on there. So, right, one is it's changing all the time, right? It's very difficult to stay on top of. It's a full-time job for you. It's a full-time job for me to always stay on top of the trends and what's changing. And I think the other thing that causes problems here is it's not just one thing, right? So you think about the more typical, legacy forms of campaigning. You can have a mail vendor, right? Someone who is an expert at doing mail. You can have someone who is an expert at phones. It is very difficult to have a single sort of expert on all things digital, because it means a lot of things to different people. There's a lot of stuff that gets put into that vertical. So I think that's probably part of the challenge.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I've been doing this a long time. When I got involved, I remember reading articles about political market or how to market on Usenet news groups, right?
Geez.
Yeah, which look it up, kids. They were an early form of discussion group. And then, if you've been in this field a while, you had time to adapt to changes in email fundraising. You had time to learn how to use Facebook advertising as it came out. You had time to get exposed to easy video production with cell phones and tablets and that sort of thing. But if you're just dropping into it, it's a huge amount, right? If say you're a one-person digital, campaign for a statewide race even, and plenty of statewide races now still have like a single digital person if they're lucky. You've got to know everything from, grassroots tech to email fundraising to volunteer management to digital advertising, and figure out how to allocate your time and a limited budget among all these things.
So what's something that campaign decision makers need to hear about digital campaigning as they're trying to make these decisions, and how to wrap their hands around this?
Well, one thing, the advice that I just consistently hear, across the board is the earlier you start, the better, right? I remember my friend Jason Rosenbaum years ago suggesting that a campaign's first hire should be a digital person, because they're going to build the infrastructure that you need, when you don't want to launch without an email sign-up form or a Facebook page for people to connect with you on, right?
Right.
So, yeah. So I think too often that the digital team is siloed off in a basement somewhere. I remember being on a panel with Eric Frenchman years ago. He was doing search ads, Google ads for the McCain campaign in '08, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
And
right.
yeah, he was off, in a silo, and he was seeing trends in the search data that he would later see, in the political news coverage, that he could see what people were looking for as an indicator of the way the discourse was going to go. But because he was off in a silo, that information never really got to anybody who could make decisions, in the McCain campaign. That's just a small example. But, often the digital folks are an afterthought.
Mm-hmm.
They're not up at the table. I remember Joe Rosbars, who ran digital in Obama's, hands-on in Obama's first campaign, and then, was involved in it later. But he talked about how important it was for the digital team to be co-equal with the mail people or the media people, or the television people, that the digital person was going to have insights that were going to help everyone else do their jobs better.
Yeah. Well, and I think we've definitely achieved that insofar. We used to talk about seat at the table, right? So digital definitely has its seat at the table. I think one of the things that sort of the next hurdle to overcome is when the decision makers on campaigns, so the people who, when the door closes, are figuring out where budgets go and what you're going to do, are digital natives.
Yeah.
And that just takes some age. That just takes some, and again, I think it also takes people growing up out of the shadow of kind of like the previous class. So one of the things I always like to wonder about is, do you think we'll have a digital department, maybe 10 years, 20, push it out however far you want to go? Do you think we'll still have a digital department that's separate, or will it just be totally integrated in everything that a campaign does?
Well, I think it'll be integrated in everything that a campaign does, but there'll still be specialization involved, right? Like you may not, honestly, it really depends on where the tech platforms go themselves. How are people going to consume their information? If Mark Zuckerberg is right, we'll do everything we do in the metaverse, right? I don't think that's going to happen. But those are the kinds of changes that could happen that will affect, how campaigns are structured. They'll be structured based on, how the media mix is evolving and how campaign practices are evolving. Field organizers are often kind of pushed off into their own little corner, right? But if you, again, go back to '08 and 2012 Obama campaigns, they were making strategic decisions where to send surrogates, for example, based on partially on polling data, but also on field data that, was allowed to filter up to the top, right? So
that also was the culture of the candidate being a community organizer himself.
Being a community organizer, exactly. They trusted conversations on the ground in a way that a lot of political media people, television people weren't going to.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So, as field rises, it starts to need more of a seat at the table too. But, I still think that there will be specialization required to get the most out of digital tools. But I think that the media delivery systems are going to converge over time.
Okay. Yeah. So it's more of a, does digital mean cutting edge technology, in which case there is some specialization that is going to be needed there. But if you think about digital as communications, or the infrastructure, well, that's already been integrated in every aspect of the campaign, because it's not like there's a team that doesn't use email.
Exactly.
And so I'm curious if, you talked about Usenet, and you were really early in .com. So Web 1, we've survived Web 2 with social media. So you've seen that arc. I'm curious, what was your expectation for kind of the social media era of politics and campaigning? And do you think on the whole that it's been a net positive for politics and democracy?
Yeah, well,
you have 2 minutes to respond.
Well, if you go back, I wrote...
But I asked this, Colin, because you have a perspective that a lot of people don't. So, I first started working on Capitol Hill the same month that Twitter came online. So,
which still puts you in like probably the first 20% of adopters.
Well, I feel very old most of the time when I'm talking with colleagues. But.
No, I think, I wasn't as much I wasn't a social media utopian, right? There was a lot of talk in like 2007, 2008 that social media was going to completely replace email, completely replace, other means that candidates would use to stay in touch with people. And it simply hasn't. I think that social connection still has the potential. I think it's very strong for grassroots organizers. We've seen protesters around the world use social media to organize and continue to do it. We've watched the Ukrainians, when the Russians were invading, organize their own, survival networks, basically, over social media. Where I think it really missed the boat was when they chose to prioritize engagement over every single other criterion. That's when the extreme content, the most shocking, the most out there is going to get engagement. And that allowed a relatively small number of people to take over the conversation online. I think that they allowed us to poison that well.
Right.
And for something like Facebook, I don't know how easily it comes back. The other thing, I don't think I really predicted just the sheer volume of content that we would be swamped with. I remember asking Chuck Todd a question about that after a presentation like 15 years ago. How are we going to tell the good stuff from the bad? And it kind of blew me off. But, we are swimming in, the flooding the zone with poop, right? We are swimming in that world right now. AI may be one of those things that helps us cut out, helps us filter information out. I have a friend, a Ukrainian friend, who's working on a project with the government for, AI assisted Russian disinformation tracking, right? Wow. I think that in some way we're all going to have to be our own, bullshit detectors.
So, yeah, it does seem like social media is very effective at connecting the initial, making sure communities of interest or people find each other. But then when it comes down to the serious relationship building or the real work goes into more closed spaces, whether that is Facebook groups or WhatsApp or in-person meetings, but it
Slack channels.
Yeah. And so it doesn't have that long-term capacity that we really thought it, would be. And there's a reason that people don't talk to each other all the time. Right?
That's a very good point. But what I miss the early days of Facebook when I would actually see content from my friends, And
now it's just press releases. I mean, that's really what it has turned into.
It's yeah. And if you try to post a link to something substantive, like I posted a link to an Atlantic article the other day, nobody will see it, because again, they have prioritized engagement over information.
Right. And it does, yeah, you point that out, and it does strike me as one of those decisions that was made early on by someone who I think we won't ever know who that person was, but it was well-meaning, right? It was so like, how do we show people the best, the most engaging content? And then it had this like butterfly effect with the rest of the world, similar to like banner ads in
I think
the
you
.com
can
era.
point. I think you can point to some very specific decisions that Facebook in particular made about 2018,
Right.
maybe a little earlier, but they made changes to the content distribution algorithm that prioritized engagement over if I understand it right, that prioritized engagement over content from friends. And that was designed to keep us on the platform longer so we can see more ads. To me,
Right.
it was a business decision. I would argue a very short-sighted one, but I think it
Yeah.
was a business decision. Yeah.
You're listening to the Business of Politics show. I'm speaking with Colin Delany, the founder of epolitics.com, about all things digital campaigning. You're back out with the latest edition. I think it's the 10th edition of your How to Use the Internet to Change the World and Win Elections book. I'm going to ask you to put your pundit hat on. You work on the other side of the aisle from me. How would you rate and review the strengths of Republican versus Democratic digital campaigning right now?
Well, I mean, they're good at different things, right? You know, except for the parts like the pro-life movement, the conservative side has not embraced field organizing and like organic list building, the kind of people-y sorts of things.
Yeah.
As much as the left has. And, there are lots of reasons for that. You mentioned Obama's background as a community organizer. I just think that ethic is built into the work that a lot of people do as they come up in the democratic world. But a whole lot of folks, early on, the Republicans, were doing more sophisticated work, way back, 20 years back, more sophisticated work on voter data.
Right.
But I think they embraced digital advertising much more quickly and embraced different options. There were points where, I think it was 2016, where Republican House candidates outspent Dems 4-1 on digital ads in the last, 2 months of the campaign, something like that. I think that the online advertising thing has evened out. It really now, and this is something you'll hear from Republican consultants a lot. I certainly hear it at events that I do with campaigns and elections. Is that the Democrats build lists, Republicans buy them, and I really think it would. I think it would behoove Republican campaigns to put a lot more time into that grunt work. It's trench warfare, not blitzkrieg, right? Of trying to build a list one name at a time with somebody who actually cares about you.
Well, and that's the difference between Republican campaigns and Democratic campaigns. I always tell people it's like Darwin's finches. We evolved on separate islands to tackle different problems. And
I love it. That's great.
And you've got liberals, the left, who are joiners. They have the causes that they believe in, and there's always, you're always fighting for the environment. You're always fighting for your labor union.
Exactly.
Whereas Republicans, our strength comes from what we call the Leave Us Alone coalition, and by its very name, that they're not joining groups and tabling outside of plazas and farmers markets and things like that. So it's just a different culture, and that changes the dynamics of it for sure.
No, and I think that's a really good point too, just about the culture of campaigning. And I think that is something that's evolving. My God, 25 years ago, voters were just expected to absorb TV ads and vote accordingly, right?
Right.
That the culture of campaigns across the board, Republicans.
Well, they didn't have any other choice. I think that's the big transformation.
Well, we had more choices than we thought, I think. But yeah, the digital tools certainly enable it. But that the digital revolution has allowed so many more people into the process. It's not just a handful of media consultants anymore. Right. And I think that's very healthy for innovation. It's very healthy for the culture of campaigns. And ultimately, I suspect that the conservative Gen Zers may well change the way Republican campaigns are run in the future.
Yeah. And so in your time, you've been doing this. You've convinced a lot of people, whether that's to try digital at all or try new things. What are some of your tips for getting buy-in from those campaign decision makers that might otherwise be resistant to trying something new?
Yeah. Now, I've certainly encountered this. A whole lot of my work has been with advocacy nonprofits. And you run into similar kinds of issues on campaigns. I think the advocacy nonprofits, the folks might have been entrenched a little longer and a
Right.
little harder to change, right?
Well, you don't have that public job performance review of a win-loss.
Yes, exactly.
Why be part of the solution when you can keep being part of the problem? Yeah.
Yeah, no, we have process measures in the nonprofit world. It's we sent 5 press releases out, not we won, right? But I think that the basic principles apply, across the board, which is, take time to persuade people, take time to listen to why they don't want to do X, Y, and Z, rather than just dismissing them as out of touch, which is very easy to do. The other thing I think, and this is the most important, is to find ways to test things out. Find ways to try something on a small scale so you can demonstrate to them that it works. Try Facebook advertising to, get people to come to an event. Experiment with different techniques of email fundraising to show them that XYZ works, but the thing their cousin told them doesn't work.
Right.
Yeah. So that you can that you can actually show evidence for here is why I think we should do this thing. But what you can hear all the time is that's not how we do it here.
Right. And I think one of the big challenges that I see, again, I feel like a geezer at this point, but you really need to have that experience of, being in a campaign or being an organization. On one hand, it's great that it's easier than ever for someone to start a company to be their own consultant. But on the other hand, you do need that experience. Why? Because it gives you empathy into the decision makers. So if you don't realize that a candidate or a campaign manager is worried about their burn rate and their cash on hand, and you go in and suggest that they, do this, that, or the other, well, you're going to run into a brick wall every time. But it's only being on that campaign where you run out of money that you appreciate what they're going through.
Well, and I think too, that's definitely absolutely true. Also, you understand more the pressures that they're under.
Right.
Like when the human brain is under, has to make 15 incredibly important decisions in a 5-hour period, right?
We're not built.
Stress starts to dull you. My first experience in politics was working as staff to a member of the Texas legislature way back in the way on back. And, after
like when Democrats still ran,
it was the Democratic Party was in the process of imploding. I worked for a conservative Dem who was probably the last Democrat to hold that seat for the foreseeable future. But, after a couple of months of session, we were just loopy as hell, right? From stress, lack of sleep, et cetera. And I do think that may be one reason that campaign managers or decision makers can sometimes throw up obstacles, is that they're simply too stressed to handle another variable.
Right.
And that's something that unless you've been in that kind of environment, it's harder to understand.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that we talk about on this show a lot is pattern recognition. It's a very important heuristic for campaign managers, consultants, candidates for making decisions and understanding that pattern that you fit into, whether it's a request, whether it's a pitch, whether it's trying to get hired. You really need to understand how that all fits together.
That's a great point. I had never really thought of it that way, but I really appreciate that idea. Yeah.
And so, Colin, I want to ask you another challenge that I see a lot, and I'm curious if you've noticed this too. Particularly on social media, the online fundraising, some of these bigger, more innovative digital tactics, they're not going down the ballot in the ways that canvassing, direct mail, even some forms of broadcast advertising are going. Do you think we're going to see a fork where there's kind of like the national level high priority campaigns and then the campaigns below? Or do you think there's going to be a generational shift? Where do you see that tension resolving?
Good question. I think there probably will be some kind of generational shift in adoption of some tech. But I do think that with the down ballot, the biggest struggle is simply the resources since so many things in like the digital organizing world aren't that expensive, the main resource is time, right? It's that mental energy I was just talking about. That if you're running for state ledge and you've got a staffer and a bunch of volunteers, it is really hard to put more sophisticated tech ideas to work, even if you would like to. Groups have tried. There was Tech for Campaigns, things like that, would try to connect techies with political campaigns. I know it's done on the left. I assume it's been done on the right too. That, but they're great at going in and setting up your Facebook page or setting up your Gmail or something like that. But when it comes to campaign, like organizing your campaign to take the best advantage of the tech options that are open to you, that is a really big question. Right. I think consultants aren't going out of business anytime soon.
Yeah, because so many people want that turnkey. I just hired a consultant and it's done. And you and I know that that's not how digital organizing works. That's not how content creation online, audience building works. So I think that figuring out the business model is going to be the challenge there. So we obviously have seen our share of fads and trends in campaigns. And I think this year is setting up to be the AI election cycle. What's your, and to be clear, saying that's the fad is that it's going to be the AI election. Where do you see that fitting in with the grand scheme of things? Is it going to totally revolutionize the way we run campaigns, or is it going to be something a little more subtle than that?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think that a lot of the people who are hyping AI in politics haven't dug that deeply into it, right? I think that the people who are actually working with it day to day are often a lot more measured in how they approach, how they talk about it, than the hype meisters are. There are still a lot, and I wrote about this in Campaigns and Elections just recently. There are a lot of barriers to entry that aren't obvious, right? Like you ask ChatGPT to write you a fundraising email, and it's going to write a very generic, bland fundraising email. Now, if you're the Democratic National Committee and you can feed it, you can prompt the AI with 30 really high performing email fundraising messages and ask it to create more in that vein, you can get some good results out of it.
Well, ChatGPT should probably stop you at that point, right?
It should.
If it does.
Yeah, because not everyone knows. I didn't actually know until recently, is that they changed their terms of use. But I was just using that as an example.
Right. No. Yeah. Well, that's one of the challenges, right? Because it's not exactly friendly to our work.
And it takes specialization to get a whole lot of benefit out of it. Now, there are going to be individual tech nerds out there on down ballot campaigns who will have a blast with it, who will use it to create, email content, cut turf for, turn a spreadsheet into optimized walk lists, whatever.
Yeah.
But I do think that those are going to be more productivity gains on the margins rather than something that's transformative. Now, deep fakes, obviously, and I know your guest a couple of weeks ago talked a lot about this, but, there are limitations on the deep fakes too. The same way that people put stock footage or stock images that are completely inappropriate. They're the wrong country.
Right, yeah.
Immediately people are like, what the hell? I mean, you're seeing campaign style videos that are trying to show the military, campaign style videos that are trying to show the military generically, and they're showing the wrong army,
or fighter jet from Europe. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Russian uniforms, the kind of thing that a nerd like me might spot, but a normal person who's not embedded in the nerd world as much, there are going to be things that they are far less likely to catch. And I don't think it's going to take too many news stories about, somebody's terrible AI video that it's going to chase in campaigns. And I think it's really incumbent on us. Give you a small example. I was talking to my friend Henry McKembe the other day. He runs Do Big Things, which works with Democratic candidates a lot. And he talked about, how many campaigns has plagiarism ended, right? So you get a chatbot to write your campaign speech, a speech for your candidate. And all of a sudden they're, Joe Biden in 1987, and they have to drop out of the race. So you're writing their concession speech next. Yeah. So those are the kinds of those are the kind of things that I think are going to temper how we use this.
Yeah, and I again, I just keep going back to this idea of these tools are all about leverage, and to your point, getting improvements at the margins rather than the big swings, and so I think there'll be it's definitely the shiny object. There are going to be the spectacular failures, but the successes will be very quiet. And on the other side of the coin, what's a digital campaigning trend that you're ready to say goodbye to in 2024?
That's a good question. I don't have a good one for that one. I think some are going to die on their own. What I would love to get rid of, and will never go away, is gee whiz news coverage of the latest, the thing that's driving the AI hype. I was talking, when I talk to reporters these days, I bring up the micro-targeting hype of, 10 years ago that, it helps us, micro-targeting helps us get more out of our budget and might identify some voter niches, and help us reach them effectively. But it hasn't utterly transformed, we aren't out there manipulating people's brains,
Right. Yeah. Well, and by the way, in many cases, it starts to backfire, right? If you're micro-targeting people based on their past electoral performance. Yeah.
And that brings up, one of the big problems, I think, and this is a particular problem for Democrats, because I think Democrats have more potential voters who are not voting out there, I think. And yet, in a lot of places, these people have never been canvassed. They're obviously not in the voter file if they're not registered.
Right.
And for Democrats in particular, I think that is a huge challenge that, if you look at how Georgia has changed, in part, it is because of not just Stacey Abrams' group, but a lot of groups out there organizing non-voters.
Yeah, I'm seeing the same thing, too, on our side. The Center for Campaign Innovation did a survey in Virginia last year in one of the congressional races, and fully about a third of the people who voted in the primary didn't have any previous primary vote history. That has to do with some of the vagaries of Virginia. We still have a lot of state-run or party-run contests, but if you were just going on the voter file, you would have missed a third of the electorate. So that's certainly that over targeting. I have to say I really love the hype cycles just because it helps gin up investors and people who are excited want to build that kind of stuff, especially when it's your side doing it. I could say, oh, look what they're building.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, the fastest way to, the Pentagon runs on that, right? They've been putting out, it's very funny to go back. I have actually looked at a couple of the threat assessments from back in the 70s against the Soviet Union, and they're pretty funny. The Russians were about to beat us every day.
Right. Meanwhile, they can barely feed their people.
Exactly. So, if you see the other side doing something, that is a fantastic way to get budget.
Right. Well, I want to say thank you to Colin for a great conversation. Make sure that you go subscribe to epolitics.com. It's a weekly must read for me, and his new book is great. It's got some good insights if you want to see what the other side is up to. but also good tips for everyone involved. And to be fair to Colin, it is bipartisan. There's
oh yes, I mean I make fun of you guys sometimes, but that's okay.
And there's a link to all of that in our show notes. If this episode made you a little bit smarter or gave you something to think about, all we ask is that you share it with a friend or colleague. That helps more people find the show, and it makes you look smarter in the process. So it's a win-win all around. Remember to subscribe to the Business of Politics show wherever you get your podcasts. You can subscribe. That way you'll never miss an episode. You can also get email updates at our website, businessofpoliticspodcast.com. With that, I'll say thanks for listening. See you next time.